From the television studios of the Jack J. Valenti School of Communication at the University of Houston, this is the Discovery section of Graffiti, the electronic newsletter of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. My name is John David Powell. Monica Perales is an assistant professor of history and the recipient of the 2008 Article Prize from the Oral History Association. Her work, Fighting to Stay in Smeltertown, Lead Contamination and Environmental Justice in a Mexican-American Community, looks at the 1970s lead contamination case that brought about the demise of a Mexican working-class barrio in El Paso, Texas, known as Smeltertown. The biennial award recognizes the use of oral history in a published work to make a significant contribution to contemporary scholarship. Professor Perales received her doctorate from Stanford University in 2004. She has been with the University of Houston since 2004, and we're happy to have you here in our Discovery section.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
This was back in the 70s.
Yes.
You weren't too old then.
No.
So how did you decide on this particular topic, and how did you go about researching it?
Well, Smeltertown had been a part of my memory for as long as I can remember. My family actually came from Smeltertown. 3 of my grandparents were born in Smeltertown, and one grandparent came when she was very young. And they came to work at the copper smelter that located in El Paso there on the border in the 1880s. And so I had always had these stories about Smeltertown as a part of my growing up. Mm-hmm. And when I was a master's student at the University of Texas at El Paso, I was taking a class on the history of the American West. And I thought, I think I'll write a paper about Smeltertown. Come to find that very little information existed about Smeltertown, despite the fact that it, again, played a very big role in the lives of the people who had lived there, mm-hmm. and also in the collective memory of the city. And so really the research began at that point. I scoured newspapers and other kinds of public documents to try to find evidence of this Mexican working class community. And I found bits and pieces here and there. But really what opened up the world of Smeltertown to me and really kind of helped me to understand its history and what it meant to the people who live there was conducting oral history interviews, contacting folks who had lived there or whose families had lived there, and interviewing them and asking them about their experiences, mm-hmm. in Smeltertown and what it meant to them and what it looked like and where they went to school, how they worked, and all sorts of things. And this really kind of helped me to kind of flesh out the contours of a community that physically no longer exists.
Okay, give me a brief description of what happened. You got Smeltertown, mm-hmm. and there was some lead contamination. What led to the demise, and why would these people want to continue to have this community and live there? Right.
Well, the business of copper smelting, initially when the smelter located in El Paso in the late 1880s, it contained a lead smelter. So lead was a important product, an important commodity that the smelter got out of ores from throughout northern Mexico and the Southwest. Mm-hmm. Eventually they shifted to both copper and lead and eventually phased out the lead. And so lead became what is called a fugitive particulate matter, kind of a pollutant in the area. In the 1970s, with the recently created Environmental Protection Agency and new laws that kind of looked at questions of air pollution, the city began to look at what was going on. The sort of the business of lead was quite a messy and not very healthy kind of business for the environment. Sure. And for people in the area. So it started out as an air pollution case, the smoke that was coming out of the stacks. What doctors and other investigators discovered was that not only was there pollution in the air, but there was contamination on the ground, and in particular in this small radius around the smelter where a number of these working class people had lived for many generations. And so that's really kind of the lead contamination incident that gave rise to the demise of Smeltertown. There was certainly a great deal of concern, particularly because a number of the children who lived in this community had high lead content in their bloodstreams. Very dangerous, and potentially life-threatening situation. And so there was this concern for the health of the community. It was a public health issue for the city, but it was also an environmental issue, and to some degree, it was an issue of sort of public and urban policy. Now, the second part of your question, why would people want to stay there? What I discovered was that for this working community, they had, even though they didn't necessarily own the property upon which they built their homes, they, for many generations, had rented parcels of land from private individuals and built their own homes. They felt like Smeltertown was their home, sure. And they had been there for many generations. And so there was this very strong emotional attachment that people had. And I think that's something that is really interesting and perhaps kind of difficult for us to understand from our perspective, recognizing this lead contamination, but also a very strong attachment to place and how those two things kind of work together. Now, certainly they were very concerned about the health of their children, but they were also concerned about the ultimate fate of their community. And, in kind of listening to their words, it was something that was very meaningful to them, and they had infused this place with a great deal of meaning.
Smeltertown no longer exists, is that true?
It does not. The smelter is still there, although it has been mothballed since about 1999, and so it hasn't been in production for some time. Although they've been using the smelter for some recycling efforts in the interim. And there, at present, is a great controversial debate about whether or not the smelter should be allowed to reopen. And certainly, given what we know today, there are a number of issues, particularly environmental and health issues, that certainly people are raising. But if you drive by the old smelter, there's really no evidence that this place ever existed, except for a small hidden cemetery that's up this tiny road that leads to the side of the smelter.
What's there now?
Not a whole lot. It's right next to the banks of the Rio Grande. There are some buildings down there. The International Water and Boundary Commission has offices down there, but that's about it. It's pretty much an empty field for the most part.
Did the EPA have to come in and clean it up?
Well, the EPA has not. They've investigated, and there's
so this isn't a Superfund site, or is it?
Well, it's a potential Superfund site,
okay.
And that's part of the debate at present about whether or not to reopen the smelter and the concern for this contaminated piece of land that's out in that section of town.
Lawsuits? Were there any lawsuits that came out of this? This seems to be the thing to do, to sue people for such stuff. Right.
At the time, there were a number of lawsuits that were filed on behalf of families of children who had found, they did find contamination, and the company settled with these families for treatment. So they paid for the treatment, the medical treatment and hospital stays for the children, and there was some payment as far as that goes.
Sure. So you had a lot of stories.
A number of stories coming together. Really what I found was sort of broadly, three kinds of stories and three groups of people that were essentially talking about the same thing, but in some ways they were talking past one another. You had the company and its representatives, and they hired their own doctors and specialists and scientists to investigate the situation. You had the city and the health community that were very much concerned with the lead issue. And then you had the people in Smeltertown themselves. And their stories I found through oral history interviews, but also looking through newspaper accounts at the time. One of the local newspapers did a series of stories really examining the various questions and issues at stake for the people who lived there.
What's your favorite story?
What's my favorite story? Yeah. Well, I don't know that it's necessarily a happy story, but one woman that I spoke to talked about receiving the eviction notices. And she was a great lady to talk to. Just had just a wonderful storytelling kind of presence. And she talked about receiving the eviction notice and deciding that then and there that she was going to throw a big Halloween party, and it was going to be the biggest Halloween party in the neighborhood, and she was going to invite all of her friends, in a way kind of as a sign of solidarity and community in light of this impending sort of removal and destruction of the community. And so I thought that was one of the better stories, or one of the ones that sticks out in my mind, from the people who told me about their experiences.
You had family there.
They were gone by the time. Yeah. My family had moved out sometime one set of grandparents had moved out in the 1930s, and my other grandparents moved out in the 1950s. So
what do we do with something like this? You did the research, and you're writing a book.
I am.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book about Smeltertown that examines it tries to examine sort of the creation, the evolution, and the ultimate demise of Smeltertown, and how it gets recreated in collective memory and in public memory.
What do you want or what can come out of this type of research?
I think it's a very personal thing for me, as my family is from there, and it's a story that has not been told. It's a story that many people in El Paso are very familiar with. You can drive anywhere in the city, and the smokestacks are quite imposing, and yet there is this community whose history has not been told, and whose story is not a part of the fabric of the sort of narrative of El Paso history, and even the history of the region. And I think that by asking different questions and by looking at it from a different perspective, I think it illuminates all of these wonderful things we see, how a working class community evolved, and what it meant to live in the shadows of the smelter. And so I think it broadens our sense of history, and it kind of going along the idea of telling history from the bottom up. I mean, I think this is the ultimate example of that.
Knowing who we are to figure out where we're going to go.
Exactly.
So where do you go now? What's your next project, other than the book?
Right. Well, definitely the book is top on the list. I'm still very much interested in the U.S.-Mexico border region. I think that it is a very timely issue, with our discussions today about immigration, about sort of controlling movement across the borders. And so I've always been interested in this kind of historical relationship that people have to this region. In a lot of ways, I'm curious about how people create stability and stasis and permanency in a place that is perceived to be very fluid and impermanent. And so in particular, my new project looks at women and motherhood on the U.S.-Mexico border, and the ways in which sort of debates about Mexican mothers kind of enter the local dialogue about immigration, and about so whether or not these people are a part of American society or not. Mostly in the progressive era, so the turn of the 20th century is my area of interest.
You've started on this already?
I've done some work on it. I think
what have you found?
Some of my work kind of emerged from the Smeltertown project. One of the things in Smeltertown, there was a vocational school, and so this kind of was a springboard into this new project. To one of the programs that was offered at the vocational school had to do specifically with training young Mexican women in Smeltertown to cook and clean and keep a proper home and that type of thing. And part of the focus, or part of the desire, was to create a workforce, right? A labor force of young Mexican women who could be nannies and maids and laundresses and seamstresses in a border economy. But I'm also interested in how it kind of redefined motherhood and what it meant for these mothers. And I've been looking at Spanish language newspapers, and they're in El Paso, and there are a number of columns that deal with motherhood and the appropriate motherhood. So there's this interesting interplay between sort of what is an ideal American household and the role of the mother within it, but also an ideal Mexican household and the role of the mother within it. So I'm curious.
Is there an
that.
ideal, or is it a mixture?
I think that to a large degree, the ideals are quite similar. You know, there's this kind of focus on, you know, the mother as being the disseminator of culture, the mother being the one who raises the children and, you know, has a very strong influence in the home on the children and on the family as a whole. And so, you know, I would think at the time, and this is still pretty early on in the research, but I think at the time there seemed to be, or there appeared to be, more distance between the two than perhaps there actually was. And so I'm kind of interested in looking at the places where there are parallels, because, you know, sort of what are the contexts out of which each of these images emerge, I think is something really important to look at.
Monica Perales, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Houston, award-winning researcher. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Good luck in the future.
Thank you so much.
And that's our segment for today. I'm John David Powell. We'll see you next month on Graffiti.